When Allied soldiers pushed into Germany in 1945, they weren't prepared for what they found. They'd trained to fight enemy soldiers, not to witness the aftermath of industrialized murder. What these ordinary men and women saw in places like Dachau and Bergen-Belsen changed them forever. Their testimony became our window into humanity's darkest chapter, a chapter some still try to deny today. They were soldiers, prepared for the horrors of combat. They'd seen their comrades fall on beaches and battlefields, witnessed the devastation of artillery, and endured the chaos of war. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared them for what awaited as they pushed into German territory in early 1945. Think about it. What happens when everything you thought you understood about humanity shatters in an instant? This was the reality facing Allied troops as they stumbled upon Nazi concentration camps. By April 1945, American, British, and Soviet forces were discovering facilities that defied comprehension. These weren't just prisoner of war camps, they were factories of death. Staff Sergeant Zanger of the US Army later recalled, "We were combat-hardened soldiers, but we weren't prepared for what we saw." His words echo the sentiment of thousands who found themselves transformed from warriors to witnesses overnight. Military training had equipped these men with protocols for engaging enemy combatants, treating battlefield injuries, and securing territory. Nothing in their preparation addressed how to process scenes of industrial-scale murder. Combat veterans who had maintained composure through the bloodiest battles broke down in tears. Army medic Gordon Horwitz, who had treated gruesome combat wounds throughout the European campaign, wrote in his journal, "There is a difference between a man injured in battle and what we found here. These were civilians, starved intentionally, experimented upon. This was not war." When General Eisenhower visited Ohrdruf on April 12, 1945, the first camp liberated by American forces, his reaction was immediate and visceral. According to his aide, Captain Alois Leithen, the Supreme Commander's face turned ashen. Eisenhower, a man known for his stoic demeanor, stood silently before the bodies and evidence of torture. After several minutes, he turned to his staff and issued a command that would shape how we remember the Holocaust. "Get it all on record now. Photographs, films. Get the witnesses. Get their testimony. Because somewhere down the road of history, some bastard will get up and say this never happened." The psychological impact was devastating and immediate. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Weinstein described fellow soldiers retching in corners, while others stood in stunned silence, unable to process what they were seeing. Some soldiers became physically ill, while others required immediate relief from duty, unable to continue functioning. Military psychiatrists reported cases of soldiers who became temporarily catatonic, unable to speak or respond to commands for hours after witnessing the camps. Medical personnel faced their own unique trauma. Navy Lieutenant Jack Melnick, assigned to treat survivors of Dachau, wrote, "The medical training I received prepared me for injuries, disease, even mass casualties, but not for humans deliberately reduced to living skeletons through systematic starvation." Many camp survivors weighed less than 80 pounds, adults with bodies like children, covered in sores and ravaged by disease. Modern psychological research has identified what these liberators experienced as acute trauma response, often leading to what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Dr. Robert Abrams, who studied the long-term psychological effects on camp liberators, found that many experienced flashbacks, nightmares, and emotional numbness for decades. These men couldn't talk about what they saw, Abrams noted. Many went 50 years before they could begin to process it. Some never did. What explains this profound, lasting impact? Unlike combat trauma, where soldiers could contextualize violence as part of warfare, the camps represented something entirely different. a calculated industrialized effort to eradicate entire populations. There was no military framework to process such deliberate cruelty against civilians, particularly children, the elderly, and other non-combatants. The atrocities weren't just crimes to be witnessed, they were crimes that demanded to be proven. When British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen, they found themselves guardians of a terrible truth. If they couldn't document what they saw with absolute precision, history might forget or deny it altogether. Military leadership understood that the sheer scale of the horror they encountered might one day be dismissed as wartime propaganda without overwhelming evidence. At Bergen-Belsen, British troops faced a nightmare beyond comprehension. Over 10,000 unburied bodies littered the grounds, with an additional 60,000 starving prisoners barely clinging to life. British photographer George Rogers later confessed, "I kept taking photos mechanically because I knew no one would believe what we saw without evidence." His hands trembled as he documented skeletal figures and mass graves. But the military directive was clear: capture everything, no matter how disturbing. The Allied forces deployed a systematic approach to documentation that went far beyond ordinary war reporting. At camps across Germany and Poland, military units established specialized evidence collection teams. They numbered and photographed mass graves from multiple angles, collected sworn testimonies from both survivors and guards, and carefully preserved documents that camp staff had attempted to destroy. U.S. Signal Corps photographers were ordered to use standardized techniques, wide establishing shots to show scale, medium shots for context, and close-ups of specific atrocities, all with identifying information and timestamps to prevent any future claims of manipulation. Hollywood director George Stevens, already famous for films like Swing Time and Gunga Din, found himself repurposed from combat documentation to evidence collection. Stevens and his crew filmed over 80,000 feet of color footage at Dachau and other camps, creating what would later become crucial courtroom evidence. "I filmed things that human eyes should never see," Stevens later wrote, knowing that someday someone would try to say none of this happened. This methodical documentation wasn't just for immediate propaganda purposes. It reflected a prescient understanding that future generations might question or deny these events. When British officers at Bergen-Belsen ordered excavations of mass graves containing thousands of bodies, they brought in public health officials and neutral observers to witness and verify their findings. Each step of documentation was witnessed by multiple parties and formally recorded. The Allies also forced local German civilians to tour the camps, often against their protests of ignorance. At Buchenwald, American troops ordered residents from nearby Weimar to walk through the camp, viewing the bodies and meeting survivors. The German civilians' reactions were themselves documented. Some wept openly, while others maintained stony expressions that soldiers described as unreadable. These tours served dual purposes: as punishment for collective indifference and as additional witnesses to prevent future denial. British psychological warfare officer Derek Sington, who helped coordinate the emergency response at Bergen-Belsen, later wrote that the camp represented the epitome of evil, a place where human dignity was not merely violated, but systematically erased. The British medical team struggled not only to treat the survivors, but to document each case clinically while processing their own horror. Captain Alan Moorhead of the British Army wrote that Bergen-Belsen's liberation was the most horrible crime ever committed in the whole history of the world, noting how medical officers broke down after days of documenting evidence, while simultaneously trying to save lives. While photographs captured the aftermath, only human testimony could reveal the systematic machinery of death that operated behind closed doors. The Allied soldiers who'd fought across Europe, men who had seen artillery tear bodies apart and cities reduced to rubble, found themselves unprepared for the stories survivors began to tell. Military documentation alone, with its clinical precision, could never convey the emotional weight of first-hand experience. What emerged from these frail voices would become the most haunting evidence of all. Rabbi Herschel Schachter, who entered Buchenwald with American forces, recalled how survivors approached him with trembling hands. They would touch my uniform, my skin, my face, as if to confirm I was real and not a hallucination brought on by starvation, he said. One survivor, Elie Wiesel, later wrote that when Rabbi Schachter entered the barracks announcing liberation, prisoners were too weak to celebrate. We had ceased to be afraid of death. We were too exhausted, too defeated. Communication presented immediate challenges. Military interpreters proved insufficient for the Tower of Babel that concentration camps had become. Jewish soldiers and Allied units often became crucial bridges between liberators and the liberated. Technical Sergeant Meyer Levin, a Jewish-American airman, described being pulled from his regular duties after officers discovered he spoke Yiddish. Suddenly, I wasn't just translating words. I was translating unspeakable experiences. These weren't military intelligence debriefings. They were confessions from the edge of the abyss. The survivors' accounts reveal the inner workings of the death machinery that no external documentation could capture. At Dachau, survivor Simon Wiesenthal guided American officers through the camp's administrative buildings, explaining the meticulous record-keeping system that tracked prisoners from arrival to death. They were more organized about killing than most businesses are about profit, noted Lieutenant Colonel Walter Fellens of the 42nd Infantry Division. Every death was accounted for, every possession cataloged. At Mauthausen, survivor Abraham Zuckerman showed American forces the 186 steps of the stairway of death, where prisoners were forced to carry heavy granite blocks uphill until they collapsed. The guards made a game of it, he told them. They would bet on how long a man could last before his heart gave out. Captain Richard Siebel, who commanded the liberation forces at Mauthausen, later admitted that nothing in military training prepares you for having someone show you where they watch their friends die, one by one, day after day. Polish survivor Luba Trininska, who had kept 54 Dutch children alive at Bergen-Belsen through extraordinary efforts, described to British nurses how she had stolen food from SS kitchens and sang to muffle children's cries. British nurse Patricia Meechan recalled, "We'd been treating the survivors for days, but hearing how this woman kept these children alive made us see the camps differently. Not just as places of death, but as battlegrounds where some fought with impossible courage." Among the most devastating testimonies were accounts of medical experiments, particularly those performed on children. At Buchenwald, survivor Yehuda Bacon guided American officers to Block 8, where Nazi doctors had conducted experiments on tuberculosis transmission. Army chaplain Captain Herschel Schachter documented Bacon's testimony. They would inject healthy children with tuberculosis bacteria, then dissect them at different stages of infection. The children called the medical wing, the place where people go but never return. American Colonel James Gamble, who oversaw evidence collection, wrote in his field journal, "Our men have seen battles that would turn civilians mad, but today I watched hardened veterans weep openly. I could not believe humans were capable of such cruelty." The legacy of those Allied witnesses lives on today as humanity's safeguard against historical revisionism. When confronted with the machinery of genocide, these ordinary soldiers became unwitting custodians of truth, transforming their trauma into testimony that defies denial. Their documentation, raw, unfiltered, and meticulous, remains our collective memory's anchor. We honor these witnesses not merely by remembering what they saw, but by remaining vigilant ourselves. History isn't a static record confined to textbooks. It's a living warning system. The camps weren't built in a day. They rose slowly through incremental dehumanization, bureaucratic indifference, and public silence. So we study these darkest chapters not to wallow in horror, but to sharpen our recognition of hatred's early symptoms. The most fitting tribute to those who bore witness is our commitment to speak up at the first signs of otherization before it metastasizes into atrocity. Because history doesn't repeat itself, but it does whisper warnings to those willing to listen.